Thank you very much, Volker. I really appreciate it, and thanks so much for the invitation. I'm very excited to speak to this to this group. Um, so that was a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. I always like to give just a little bit more, especially for a group that is unfamiliar with me. Um, for those that maybe don't know American politics as well, this is Admiral Stockdale from the 1992 election, and he famously, in the vice presidential debate, interjected with, "Who am I? Why am I here?" And so I like to kind of use that as a frame for the beginning of talks in places that I haven't been before. So, as a brief summary, I do a lot of work in technological innovation, firm competition, and drivers of consumer demand. And so, how does that link with the talk today? Well, data privacy, I would argue, touches on all of these themes. Data is playing a huge role in innovation. Data privacy has become a major concern pertaining to market power and antitrust, as I'm sure you all seen with various antitrust suits that are out there right now. And data privacy can be viewed as a service feature that influences demand and firm competition. Um, you know, Various firms out there are touting this as a desirable element of the products and services that they provide. So, kind of diving into the topic that I want to cover today, I just want to emphasize, and I don't think I have to convince this group, that valuing privacy matters. So, governments around the world are grappling with data privacy policy. Any policy, I would argue, must at least balance two things. One is privacy preferences. So, how do people feel about how they value their privacy? And then on the other end is the benefits from the use of the data. And I don't mean to say that these are the only elements, but I would argue that at least these two need to be taken into consideration when thinking about policy about data privacy. And so if you get a better understanding about privacy value, it could inform various types of regulation, including things on data ownership and rights, consumer protection from data breaches and the consequences thereof, and antitrust enforcement, just to name a few. But I would argue these are three of the main headliner areas. But then, of course, there are challenges with this. So, what I'm about to present to you all, there's not too much out there along these lines, especially at the international level, that comes down to valuing privacy. And one of the reasons is it can be difficult to measure people's privacy preferences. And I imagine that anyone here that has been looking at privacy issues, as I have, the one thing that comes up in any talk that I give, people talk about what's known as the privacy paradox, right? And it really adds another level of competition, complication. And for those, that are less familiar, the privacy paradox really just boils down to this apparent discrepancy in what people say they think about privacy and how they behave with regard to privacy. And I don't want to go down that road today, but there's a lot of papers out there that have tried to reconcile that discrepancy in various ways. But the bottom line for me today is just that it adds another layer of challenge when one wants to try and get a sense of how do people really feel about their data privacy. There's a lot of prior work looking at privacy preferences or attempting to do so. I'll very briefly summarize that. I want to get to the good stuff that I've got for you today, but just to kind of put a frame on it, general sentiment about privacy indicates that there is some concerns. So there are majorities and super majorities that believe that current privacy laws are insufficient. Now, of course, we've got variation in the laws globally, but as a general matter, there's still quite a bit of kind of discontentment with what the policy and the privacy laws are in terms of protecting data privacy. And also there's an interest in having control of who can get our information. This next slide, I don't want to talk through it all. This is a zoom out slide. What I'm providing here is just a sampling of some empirical attempts to try and measure privacy preferences. And the main thing I just want to point you to is there's willingness to accept and willingness to pay type studies. That's the second column. So how much are you willing to pay to keep your data private versus how much are you willing to accept in order for someone to get your data? So there are those different lenses through which people try to make these measurements. And then if we look at the third column, main thing I want you to focus on is the variation in methods. So there's a variety of ways that people have tried to get at these measurements: hypothetical auctions, direct elicitation, discrete choice experiments, field experiments. So there's a range. So now what do we do, right? So coming from that lens, what are we trying to do? We're using conjoint survey techniques to measure willingness to accept for online data. And we're going to compare and contrast those measures for a range of data types across 6 different countries. And I'm going to actually present you 2 sets of results today. So this is the first set. This is going to be more Latin American focused, although this, also has the my host country today, Germany, involved. So we have Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Germany, Mexico, United States, and then we have 4 platforms. We have your bank, your carrier, uh, Facebook, and your smartphone. And basically, what are we doing with these? These surveys are going to offer choices with different levels of data privacy and monthly payments. So this is looking through the lens where if one had rights to their data and the company had to pay you to give up those rights, what would those payments need to be? And this is rooted in real and proposed data markets that are out there. So there was, for those that maybe have dabbled in this, there was a market called Data Coup. There's another market called Turtle. So there actually are on the private sector markets out there where people will pay you for you to give up certain information, certain personal information. And then the other thing that I think is important is that these types of surveys are very well suited for measuring trade-offs. And so, it's very much like how people make purchases online. I'm going to show you various options. They're going to vary on different dimensions, and you can compare and contrast and tell me which one you like the most. We'll come back to this, but just to give you it all in one place, what are the types of information we're talking about here? We're talking about things like location, browsing history, your contacts, friend networks, biometrics, things like fingerprints and voice print, financial information like your bank balance, and then a stream of your withdrawals. And just for those that are less familiar with these types of elicitation methods, here's an example of a choice occasion for someone that takes the survey. As you can see, what I've got is in the columns, options 1 through 4. Those are the choices that you have. Which of these would you prefer of the 4? And then along the rows, you can see the dimensions along which they vary. So these are varying in terms of what kind of information would you be giving up, right? And so this is binary. You either give it up or you don't. And then they're going to vary in what the payments would be accordingly. And so one way to kind of get a sense of it, if you look at option 2 versus option 3, notice they only vary in whether or not they share information about your friend network and in what the payment is. And so basically what's going to happen is as people make these choices, if you just zero in on 2 versus 3, if you choose option 3, then essentially that's telling me you're willing to give up your friend network information in exchange for another 50 cents per month. If you choose option 2, you're telling me you're not willing to make that trade. And then imagine now you've got thousands and thousands of these choices. It allows us to then zero in on what the implied valuation is for each of these types of data in terms of giving it up to this company, in this case, Facebook. So now a little bit more detail on the survey, and then I'll get to the fun stuff. So we used what is a major international firm called Dynata. At the time, it was called Research Now. There were 2 different firms out there, kind of primary ones, Research Now and SSI. They merged to be Dynata. They administer these surveys online. They have standing panels all around the world that complete these surveys, and they have a lot of checks to make sure that these are valid completions. We have 325 surveys per type, so we've got 6 countries, 4 platforms. And then we also do basic screens to make sure on who fills these out. Things like, are you over 18? Do you have, for example, existing accounts for everything except for a bank? We allow people without an existing bank account to fill them out. And then a little bit on just the analysis part. For those with an economics background, I imagine this will be familiar. For those that don't, I will kind of be very high level, but I hopefully will get clear what the essence of it is. So what we do is we basically construct choice sets to efficiently identify the value of each type of data privacy. So imagine that example I gave you. I'm going to vary that up in multiple ways. So then across all these people, they're going to make a bunch of different choices with all these different ways that the choices are being presented. And then underlying all that, we're gonna have a standard utility model. So we'll basically say You get utility that's based upon the features of the options that you're provided, and you're going to choose the one that yields the highest utility. And so the inputs are going to be whether data are shared or not, and also what the payment is. And then, keeping it very simple, you think about then what's your willingness to accept for data privacy? It's the utility of the data sharing, right, divided by the utility of money. So essentially, how much utility do I lose by giving up that information compared to how much utility do I gain for the money that you might pay me for that? And so then if you think about it in the terms of our utility model, it's just the coefficient on the data sharing element. So are you sharing, for example, your withdrawal information divided by how much utility do you get for money? And so the example here is with location, right? So how much utility do I lose in giving up my location information compared to how much utility do I gain from getting more money? The ratio of those two gives me an estimate for how much am I willing to accept to give up that particular type of information. So now let me get into the good stuff. So what do we find? Before I show you the numbers, note that everything's been adjusted to purchase power parity, conversion rates, and this is really just an attempt to do more of an apples to apples comparison in the valuations. Obviously, I know it's not perfect, but I think it does get things on a reasonably level playing field. All right, so what do we find? I'm gonna go from more to less aggregated. So this is highly aggregated. What is this? This is the average of the PPP adjusted willingness to accept for each of the different data types across all of the countries, right? So this is not country specific. We have 6 different countries. If I average them up, right, this is what the willingness to accept looks like across the different data types. And a couple things, I'll provide a summary at the end, but I'll just kind of highlight a few things as we're looking at the graphs. Um, Notice that financial information, it tends to be at the higher end. You also have fingerprint kind of is way up there. And then you've got, the texts that stand out a little bit. But as a broad, swath, the big ones that I would highlight are the financial information and some biometric information. But again, this is averaged off of everybody. The other thing that I'll point out is if you look at the right end, sharing location is clearly the lowest. And I find that interesting because for anyone that's looked at this research over the years, in the early days, back in the early 2000s, location was often the focal point. A lot of people had research talking about uh, concerns about giving up location information. That seems to have waned quite a bit, and I think there's an obvious reason why. I think people now have seen a lot of benefits to giving up location information, right? So you want to call an Uber, right? You want to find the nearest restaurant, whatever. If you're giving up your information on where you are, those benefits are more easily realized. All right, so now we're going to zoom out just a little bit. Same sets of data. Now I'm giving you the country specific measures, right? Again, I know there's a lot of information to process, so I will summarize at the end. I would just point you in a couple things. One is, I'm especially pleased to be giving this in Germany today. So one of the things I always highlight is that, look at the orange bar. Orange bar is on the left end for almost all of these. So Germans do value their data privacy. It certainly appears to be the case. So they have a high willingness to accept in order to give up their personal information. And that's pretty consistent. The other one I think always I've found intriguing, people often have found pretty interesting. If we also included the ability to receive ads, right? So advertisements. Um, and for several of our Latin American countries, they actually indicated a value preferring to receive ads. I think sometimes that's a bit against the grain. Um, but at the same time, there's plenty of literature that could point to people finding a net benefit in receiving ads, right? You might be informed about a product that you like, and all those kinds of things. So uh, we don't see that much aversion to ads, and in fact, in some cases, we see preferences for those. All right, so now this zooms out even further, and there's one thing I really want to kind of point out in this graph, and I find this one personally to be the most interesting. What we have here is broken down by the 4 platforms I described earlier. Each of the data types, now those are color coded, and now looking at each of the 6 countries that we look at. Obviously, it's a lot of information to process, but if you step back and look at the overall patterns, one thing I want you to recognize is that the relative rankings are almost exactly the same across all six countries, across all the platforms. So if you look at, which bar is the highest, second highest, third highest, lowest, and you look at that country to country to country, it's almost always the exact same rank ordering. And I think that's an important thing to take away because one of the things I highlight about these surveys is they're hypothetical. You're not actually receiving that money. And so there's the standard critique that, do people really, are these the actual decisions that they would make? Well, fair enough. Maybe they wouldn't, make that trade in terms of if real money was on the line. But one thing that generally has been found is that these are very good at identifying trade-offs. So in terms of, how would I trade off one versus the other? And what that means is that I have quite a lot of confidence in the ranking that they produce, right? So which one comes out on top, that really is the one that people care the most about, and then on down the line. And so I think this is a very meaningful result in that we're finding extremely high consistency in the ranking of which data types people find the most down to the least valuable. And so let me kind of summarize that. So we've got uh, for our six countries, the relative values for privacy are similar. What does that mean? It means that public and private policies with regard to data privacy may want to offer similar relative protections to the extent that those can be offered. As I highlighted before, financial and biometric privacy appears to be most valued, location privacy less so. And also, as I highlighted, Germany stands out as valuing privacy the most, and especially for financial information. They really stand out in that regard. Some additional analysis that is a little bit difficult for me to give you visually, but let me just summarize it briefly. Um, we also did, for those that have gone into empirical economics, we did some random coefficients estimates, and essentially what we're doing is trying to get a sense of the distribution of willingnesses to accept. Right, everything I've provided you is basically on average, but behind the scenes we can get an estimate of what the distribution appears to look like for each of the countries. What we found in doing that is that the within country variation in the value of privacy is similar across our six countries. So in a sense, the spread in how much people value these different data types is pretty similar. What does that mean? Well, it means that tiered protections, if you allowed for different tiers, different amounts of protection, may have comparable appeal across countries. And the distribution of support for public policies may be similar across countries. And the one thing I'll highlight, again, Germany appears to be a bit of an exception. They had the most homogeneous preferences. So there was less spread in the willingnesses to accept across our respondents. And then one other thing I'll highlight, we also looked at correlations in people's willingnesses to accept across the different data types. So again, for those that have studied this area, picture in your mind the covariance matrix that we would estimate for random coefficients. And so the off diagonals are generally all positive. So perhaps not surprising. So if you value one data type a lot, you tend to value another one highly as well. Although that does, I think, have a very clear economic importance. And it suggests that policies of bundling protections are unlikely to homogenize preferences. So for those that are familiar with the bundling literature, a standard point that's made is that if you have negatively correlated preferences, bundles then can combine them in such a way that it flattens out the distribution of preferences more, which allows then bundlers to more efficiently extract surplus. But in this case, that doesn't seem to be a viable alternative. One other thing I'll highlight, and then I'll get into our second study. We also did some demographic breakdowns, and I found this very interesting. So, we did it by kind of the standard stuff you'll see in various census and other types of surveys that are out there. It's pretty well documented in many cases that you'll see differences in preferences for many things by sex and by age. But you also typically see it by income as well. And in this case, I found it very interesting that, the income differential was almost nothing. The one place that you see it is on some financial information, but otherwise, it's actually very, very consistent across income cuts. And so just to summarize that, if you look at male versus female, it's about a 2x difference, female more than male. Older, if you do, the age was cut across the age of 45. So those over 45 versus under 45. Um, this is also consistent with some other studies that are out there that suggest that younger people don't seem to value privacy as much. And I know there's, variance in that, but it seems to be by a significant margin. But then, as I highlighted, income does not predict willingness to accept very well. And so, there's various applications. I kind of talked about this up front, but in the interest of time, let me dive into our second study. Uh, and this one's more recent. So, just to kind of for some perspective, the work I just presented to you, that's in a published paper. This work that I'm about to show you is currently under review. So we've got this kind of series of papers that we've done. The second paper is focused on data localization. And for those that are not familiar with this, it it basically encompasses measures that require certain types of data to be stored in its country of origin. And this has been a hot topic. After we did our first study, we talked to a bunch of people with vested interest in this space and kind of tried to get a sense of, what are the topics that are top of mind. And this one consistently came up, right? Data localization issues. And so the rules on along these lines can take many forms. So it could be just fully preventing information from being sent outside the country. Could be that you have to store a local copy of the data. Could be that you're imposing taxes on data exports. Could be requiring subjects' consent before moving the data to another country. We're going to focus on the first, the more strict version. And I'm all ears in the Q&A in case I'm missing recent developments in this area. But a number of countries have either enacted or are considering enacting data localization laws. So you have Kazakhstan, Russia, China, Vietnam have them in place. There's considerations amongst France, the United States. I don't have to tell this group, but the GDPR also imposes a form of data localization, so it places restrictions on exporting data outside of the EU. But then on the flip side, some trade partnerships have actually outlawed data localization rules. So even coming back to the EU, uh, it's expressed that data localization should be at the EU level and should not be enacted by member countries individually. And so when you think about proponents and detractors of data localization laws, they have a variety of differing objectives. From a welfare standpoint, the cited consequences of these laws could improve or worsen welfare. And I'll get into some of the dimensions along which that might be the case in a minute. But the punchline here is to make an optimal decision in terms of welfare, we have to weigh the estimated magnitude of the countervailing effects. And so just like the previous project, the goal here is to try and contribute one piece of what we think is a much bigger puzzle. And so what are some of the consequences of data localization? So there's a nice paper by Bailey and Pashira in 2018 that highlight three categories of consequences of data localization: civil liberties, government functioning, and economic. So from the civil liberties standpoint, there's considerations like the right to privacy, protection from government surveillance, freedom of speech and expression. If you go into government functioning, there's considerations of needing data access for the discharge of enforcement and regulatory functions. So basically having this confidence that the data is available locally to be able to administer those services. And then also preserving national security interests is another one that often gets highlighted. And then on the economic side, a lot of the critics of these laws will point to this being just an attempt for protectionism, that you're imposing this law to keep the data local, which then basically shuts out foreign companies from being able to be effective competitors in your country. And of course, if that's the case, then it could be at the expense of gains from trade, which then potentially could have a loss of efficiency for global firms. And one side note on this, for those that uh, haven't looked deeply at this, in doing this project, it was very interesting for me to learn when you think about this number two, the government functioning and the national security interests, a lot of, from a US standpoint, there's often the perspective of, we might need these laws to protect us from certain countries, maybe China or Russia, or Iran, countries with whom we have some form of adversarial relationship. But what I came to learn is a lot of the data localization laws that we've seen around the world are actually in response to the United States. So there was an uptick in these types of laws following the revelations by Edward Snowden here in the United States. Um, and so then other countries basically said, oh, wait a second. So now if our data is at the US, then we might not be confident that it's secure. So we might want to have data localization laws to prevent from that. So very eye-opening as an American, but understandable. So consequences of data localization, as with privacy policy in general, the key element of any relevant cost benefit analysis, I would argue, is how citizens value their data privacy, and in particular, how they value localization of data. And so this is the element that we're hoping to inform with our research. And so I'll be quick with this because the methods are going to be very similar, but I'm going to highlight just where there's a differential. Um, so the prior work, measures the relative value of personal data itself. What we're going to do is incorporate another layer by having a localization element to it. So we're going to analyze how the willingness to accept to give up privacy varies by the degree of localization. And what do I mean by that? So we're going to provide what are, we believe, the first estimates of citizens' willingness to accept for localization of personal data. And we're going to compare these across several countries again. And along the way, we'll calculate this willingness to accept for privacy in general, willingness to accept to give up their data in general, which we'll be able to triangulate with our previous study. As far as kind of the international comparisons, which is what we've been basically doing with all these studies, I would argue, especially with data localization, this is the natural focus when it comes to assessing these types of preferences. And as I said, to date, we're not aware of anybody that has this. So to give you some specifics briefly, just like before, we have a range of countries. This is going to be more globally spanning. So we've got the United States, United Kingdom, South Korea, Japan, Italy, India, and France. So now we have a much more significant representation of Europe and Asia. And then we have 5 platforms. There's some overlap with what we did before. So we've got your bank, your healthcare app, smartphone, your home smart device, and social media. This next slide, this is a lot. Don't worry about it. We'll drill down once we get the results, but just to give you a step back picture of the range of data types that we're talking about. As you can see, it's a range of healthcare information, financial information, biometric information, and some personal identifying information, amongst others that we're going to be looking at. So here's the key distinction from before. Before we had a binary decision, so is your data being shared or not? Now we have a 4-level situation where, again, we have the no sharing element, but now when it comes to sharing, we've subdivided that into 3 categories. One would be you're sharing the data, but it will only be shared domestically. Another one is it's being shared internationally, except for China and Russia. And then the last is it's being shared internationally, uh, and there's no restrictions. And so what we're going to be doing is trying to get a value of data localization. And this is going to be the willingness to accept for international sharing relative to domestic sharing only. So now we've got a situation where I can see how much do you need to be paid for it to be shared only within your home country. How much do you need to be paid to be willing to share it with anybody, including all international countries? And then I'm going to compare those two. That difference is going to be how much you value the localization element specifically. And so the survey is going to offer choices with different levels of data privacy and monthly payments, just as before. As I noted, this is very well suited for measuring trade-offs, and that'll be the focus of the results. Uh, all right, so I've already covered that. Let me dive in. So this one, I'm not going to walk through as closely, but just to give you a sense of this is the kind of choice occasion that people would have. A little more complicated. People spend a little bit more time to work through this. But, it's one of these things where keep in mind, we've already primed them. There's a whole front end that's going to explain all of this. So it's not they just walk in and see this. But for the presentation, just so you have a sense of what we're talking about, this just literally has now the four levels of sharing that are potentially varying, but everything else is the same. You got the rows are the different data types, and then the columns are the different choices that you can have in terms of what it means with regard to how your data are being shared. And then all we ask is you indicate, which of these would you prefer the most if you had to choose amongst those four. Give me lots and lots of those choices, I can drill down on what the implied valuation is for different types of sharing. And so this is all familiar. We again went through Dynata. We got now 7 countries, 5 platforms, similar types of screens as before. Same basic uh, utility model underlying everything. Same way to measure willingness to accept. So as I mentioned, I will focus on what's different. So here, what we measure is 2 different types of data localization premiums. And what am I basically doing? I'm going to say, here's kind of actualizing the thing I described before. If you look at the first equation there on the slide, imagine the data type that we're interested in is your fingerprint. So I can think about what if I shared your fingerprint both domestically and internationally. So that's the FDI. I got fingerprint, domestic, and international. And then what if I only shared it domestically? So the denominator then is fingerprint and then domestic. So only domestic. So what I'm going to do is take the ratio of those two things, right? So how much does your utility change for one versus the other? Take the ratio and I'll subtract one, and that's going to give me a percentage estimate. So essentially what it's giving me is what's the how what percentage more do I need to give you in order to be able to go from sharing your data domestically to sharing it internationally as well, right? And then the second equation there is the same exact calculation where now I'm only thinking about sharing internationally, where China and Russia would not be included in the set. So what premium then do I have to give you in order to do that? Oh, and so before I get into the results, uh, I'll show you a bunch of graphics. Again, there's a lot here. I would encourage you to look at the paper if you really want to drill down. This is a zoom out exercise. So what I'm about to show you is confidence intervals for each of these data localization premiums. And in the presentation, you're going to be able to easily and quickly see whether zero is in those confidence intervals. So are they statistically different from zero or not? So is there a non-trivial percentage premium in what you need to be given to share internationally versus domestically? So now let me get to the first one on the home smart device. Anytime you see a blue dot, so all I'm giving you is all the countries, all the data types for the home smart device. Every time you see a blue dot, zero is in the confidence interval. So what is that telling me? If you notice, almost all of them have a blue dot. I think there's 3 exceptions and they're barely exceptions. What it's telling me is that we're not seeing a significant difference. We're not seeing a significant premium that people need to have if you want to share internationally versus only domestically. If you've got that lens in mind, I can now go to the next graphic. So now with the smartphone, same thing. Look at the colors, look at the lineup. Every time you see a blue dot, right, we're not seeing any real evidence of a data localization premium. So again, a couple exceptions, but for the most part, we're seeing very little in the line of a premium for any of these different data types across all these different countries. Same thing for finance. We do see a couple more here. Um, I would say finance is probably the one where we see the most evidence that there is at least some level of premium with regard to some financial information. In particular, the bank balance is the one where we see the most consistent evidence that there is some level of premium in keeping it local versus international. Healthcare app, pretty much blue dots up and down the line. Very little evidence of a premium there. Social media, same story. Lots of blue dots. Very little evidence of a premium there. One other thing I'll highlight is, as I mentioned, we have this other level of distinction, excuse me, where we allow for the exclusion of China and Russia when we talk about international sharing. I'm going to show you one more table of results. Again, it's going to be a zoom out. What I want you to think about is anytime you see an entry that says positive, that means there needs to be a higher data localization premium, right, when China and Russia are included in the international set. If it's negative, that means you need a lower data localization premium uh, when China and Russia are included in the international set. So positive means that people don't want China and Russia included. Negative means that they actually do want them included. Without drilling down, what do you see the most in this graph? I would argue you see a whole lot of negatives compared to positives. And in fact, virtually all the ones where we see significance, so the ones that have stars on them is where we actually see a significant difference between the two. Almost all of the occasions where that's true is where we have a negative result. What does that mean? If anything, people are indicating that if you're going to share internationally, we want China and Russia included. Why might that be the case? Well, let me get to that in a moment. But that's the main takeaway from this graphic, right? So just to summarize the findings, there's little evidence of a data localization premium, despite significant valuation of privacy for all data types. So it's not that if you go back and look at what the measurements are for just how much do you have to pay me to share the data at all, even domestically, we get wildly significant numbers for that. It's the differential, right? Domestic versus international, we're not finding much. And whenever there is some evidence, it tends to be for data types that are already highly valued. Um, and then, as I said, excluding China and Russia doesn't seem to be valuable. If anything, removing them is viewed as costly. And the places where we find that to be true, in particular, are Japan and Korea. And I would argue, I think there's a logical argument as to why that would be true, right? Those are the ones that are in their closest trading block. And so it makes sense that they might find it to be a cost to have them excluded, right? Once the data are being shared, if there's any value in having those data being shared with a regular trading partner. And so what are some implications of this? Well, the use of privacy concerns as a motivation for data localization laws may be overstated, right? So there may be some gross welfare gains for some types of data, but in general, that doesn't seem to be a primary element of what's going on here. As I noted, right, restricting prominent authoritarian countries such as China and Russia appears to have little impact on consumer value, at least for a number of highly populated countries, the ones that we look at. And in fact, in some instances, there's evidence that there's a preference to keep them in. Now, I should say, these results don't necessarily imply that there's net cost to data localization requirements, because as I noted up front, there's other potentially welfare enhancing benefits, such as national security, which I think has been a driver in some instances. However, our findings do provide a counterweight to any claim that citizens find value from imposing constraints on international data sharing. So, if anything, our results are showing that citizens may be actually mindful of the downsides of restricting access from trading partners. So, a notable takeaway from this is that welfare justifications for data localization laws shouldn't solely rely on assumed preferences of citizenry for those types of restrictions. And with that, I think I've hit my time. And I am very happy to jump into any questions.